Oh, God damn it. It's just me. All right. All right, I think I have it working. This is log instances. It was something that I was.
That's gonna work. Fantastic. Yeah. Well, no matter what, there will be a few, but this is better.
No, because they've never seen me.
Yes.
They can still get to see you. There was a small introduction before the lecture that I went to. It was really good. I left like 10 minutes to Sarah. But it was really good. Same conversations, the same for 8 months.
Can I bring him over?
Actually, if you would hold this for a second.
No, I actually wanted to see it, and I don't see a lot of American stuff.
All right.
I see a lot of.
Since he's going to wander,
No.
he's not going to stay at. Yes.
Bring him over?
Let me just see what the screen. Why is this leg?
No, it's not. Yeah, so it's
Why are my legs not right?
They are at a funny angle. Oh, they're all not pulled all the way out. You have to here. Look. Just yeah, they're all adjustable that way. So you can bring it back in, I think, a bit like that, but it doesn't lock.
It's supposed to.
Lock there. There you go. That's right.
Still, for some reason, not.
Can you just adjust it from here?
Yes, I can, but it's.
That's okay. I mean, we're going to be getting another quality version at the top.
Yeah, but this is for the stream.
Right.
Okay, yeah. Get him. All right, whatever.
He was hungry.
I have a book to sign. Please, okay. All right. I need a pen. Anna. I'm sorry I left the attendance because it's such a line.
Problem is the Zoom camera is too low. Hold on.
So I'm being a total, I'll take pictures with stars.
We're not getting an image. But I think I have it working.
You're really gonna see this picture, right?
Yes, all right. Yeah. Your students can come in. They're loving an image. If they're still safe, they can come in. But I think I have it working. Are you guys waiting to get into the talk? Yes. All right. All of you? Yeah. All right.
And they basically.
Here is space if you guys want to walk over. An image. You want to walk over? If they're still safe, they can come in. But I think I have it working. Are you guys waiting to get into the talk? Wow. Yes. All right. All of you? Yes, you guys. You guys want to walk over? An image. You want to walk over? Would you want? Yes, the image is working. Still safe, they can come in. But I think I have it working. Are you guys waiting to get into the talk? This is overclosed. There's still some space. You can pick which one you want to do. Would you want? Yeah, the image is working.
And the rest of the humanities departments, as well as many others on campus,
All
are still mourning the untimely death of the Institute's previous director, Adrian Perez-Malgoza. Adrian led the Institute in the COVID years, hardly an ideal time for any of us, so he's in many ways one of the best models for leadership in hard times that I can think of, someone I find myself now trying my best to emulate. At the Institute, we intend to continue to build on many of the brilliant programs and initiatives that Adrian instituted during his tenure here. And we'll be honoring his memory with an event celebrating his life and work this spring, and there'll be more news on that forthcoming. Tonight, we are thrilled to be a co-sponsor and be hosting Professor Snyder's visit, along with the Run Shaw Lecture Series, the Center for Changing Systems of Power, and the Provost Lecture Series. I want to give a big thank
now we're
you
at
to
a
all
point
of
where
them
the event is starting.
to
So
Rachel
you can
Rodriguez,
bring the table
Associate
back
Director
in.
of Communications for the College of Arts and Sciences, to the Director of the Center for Changing Systems of Power, Charlie Robbins, and to our new tonight, we are thrilled to finally a tremendous thank you to Adrian Unger, who run the Humanities Institute Program Coordinator for just about everything else to great program managing. I want to give a big thank you to all of them
And let them in. So you can bring the table back in.
None have been possible without her expertise. Science and Professor Director of the Center. Before I go any further, though, I need to let everyone know that to our new tonight, we are thrilled at 4:55 will be experiencing apparently for a full Stony Brook White testified against the emergency. So I want to give a big thank you to all of them. I'm probably going to silently turn my thoughts over to General Brook and anxiety. You're welcome to join me on this spiritual journey. To make it something more pleasant or creative, as you wish. In any case, I apologize for the interruption and don't be alarmed. The second thing I want to tell you is that we are going to be in mad dash at the end of the lecture at about 5:55 to get Professor Snyder to a 6:30 ferry in Port Jeff. So I maybe have to cut the question and answer session a little bit short. So I want to take just a moment to call your attention to some of the Humanities Institute's amazing programming this semester. I'm actually not going to point to anything in particular right now, but this is our first semester back in person in full force on campus. And while I want to note that under Adrian's leadership during the pandemic, the Institute ran a full and robust schedule the entire time, tremendous achievement by any measure. But we wanted to mark the return to campus with a return to our old way of advertising events, the humble but also quite powerful poster, which you'll see plastered about all around this building and others. And here's our beautiful fall poster. We have 2 or 3 events going on every week this semester, except for Thanksgiving week. And you'll find the posters all over campus. So please have a look there, or also online because of our website. So this is a little easier. And you'll find these posters everywhere. So please join us for any of these events. Some of them, many of them are hybrid, some of them are online only, and some of them are in person. So I first became aware of Timothy Snyder's work about the same time that I imagined that much of the broader U.S. public did, though of course he was already a luminary in the field. This was in late 2016 when he began writing pieces about the 2016 U.S. election and the rise of authoritarianism for the New York Times. Since then, I've been so compelled by his voice and his views that I've read nearly all of his books. And so I'm just beyond thrilled and delighted to be welcoming Tim here tonight. So now I'm just going to do a quick introduction for Isa Kalinowska-Blackwood, who is going to introduce Tim. Where is Isa? Isa is my colleague in the English department here at Stony Brook. She's also a scholar of 19th century Polish and Russian literature, and more recently of Polish and Russian cinema. I got to know Isa a lot better this last spring when she recruited me to teach a week-long online summer class to Ukrainian university students whose educations were being disrupted by the war. I did teach a class there. It was a week-long class on James Joyce's Ulysses, and I had 11 students in it. And it was an incredible experience. When the war in Ukraine began last February, Isa began building with a team from the Kosciuszko Foundation, which is a New York-based nonprofit organization, what became known as the Flying University for Ukrainian Students. Classes were held in June, and in July, the Flying University graduated just under 100 students with certificates from the program. Timothy Snyder spoke at their online commencement ceremony, and I was in the audience at that time. And from that moment, I think the idea to invite Tim to Stony Brook got off the ground, so to speak. So as I offer my admiration and gratitude to Isa for all that she's done to help bring this event together, and especially for all she's done at the Flying University, I'll turn it over to her to introduce Tim Snyder. Thank you.
I too am absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Timothy Snyder. Richard C. Levin, Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University, and Permanent Fellow at the Institute for the Human Sciences in Vienna. His scholarship has had a very wide reach. Tim's books have been translated into 40 languages and won countless awards. Let me note that his own work has relied on and is distinguished by his command of multiple languages. He speaks 5 languages fluently, including Ukrainian, and reads 10 languages, which undoubtedly contributes to his nuanced understanding of multiple national contexts and complicated histories. His historical work focuses on Central and Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and the Holocaust. From his first publications to the most recent ones, Ukraine has played a central role in his work. 3 of his works in particular, the reconstruction of nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, 1569 to 1999, Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin, which appeared in 2010 and has since been translated into 20 languages. Blood Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning from 2015. These 3 books established his position as a leading expert on Central and Eastern European history. Timothy Snyder has also authored 2 New York Times bestsellers. On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century in 2017, stayed on the bestsellers list through 2021. The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America, 2018. Timothy Snyder is one of the greatest public intellectuals of our times. When I was thinking about this term, public intellectual, I searched and found an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson. In 1834, he wrote The American Scholar. Snyder is truly the American scholar in the Emersonian sense of the word. Coincidentally, Timothy Snyder was also awarded the Emerson Prize in the Humanities, among very, very many other prizes. To use the Emersonian language, an intellectual who understands the mind of the past is not merely a bookworm, quote, for this is worse than it seems, as Emerson says. The ideal intellectual possesses an active soul, which allows him to continuously engage in scholarship, to ask difficult questions, and look for most effective ways of communicating knowledge. For Emerson, just as important as erudite knowledge are the civic virtues of the intellectual. He has to be fearless, brave, engaged. I have had the privilege of knowing Professor Snyder for well over a decade, and I can attest to the fact that, like the Emersonian intellectual, he is a whole person. In addition to being a university of knowledge, he's also a good citizen, a great neighbor, a decent human being. Snyder lives by the principles that he has embraced in his writing. He's someone who finds the time to travel to his native Ohio and go door to door and canvass before national elections. He is someone who gets in the car and drives for over an hour to teach a class on freedom, the understandings of freedom, to a group of prison inmates. Professor Timothy Snyder has also the rare gift of attracting the attention and admiration of many of his readers and millions of online listeners, and actually antagonizing very few of those. Once again, greatest honor and pleasure. Welcome, Timothy Snyder.
So I'm gonna start by turning my phone off, and the rest of you could make sure that your various gadgets are off. Or your computers your screens are down. I'm not going to lecture the computers. I'm only going to lecture the people. But the lecture of democracy, the idea of democracy is actually closely related to this. And I'm going to start by asking you to think about the shape of this room, where we all are. So what does it mean that that the human being is supposed to be in the corner? Right? Where I'm supposed to lecture is from here. And the reason that I'm supposed to lecture from here is so that that machine can have a clear line to this room. Rooms weren't always designed like that. This is a rather recent phenomenon. That is the demotion of the human being and the notion that in interactions, for one stop to be normal direct human interactions, what we're going to do instead is look at some form of innovation, some kind of mechanized entertainment. That is actually relatively new. For your generation, I understand that it's normal, but it's quite a dramatic change. And what I want to begin by suggesting is that this change has a great deal to do with the decline of democracy. I'm not going to blame the decline of democracy on this particular lecture hall. I guess I don't know what else to say in here. Right? But what I am trying to suggest is, and what I'll be trying to argue, is that democracy is not the sort of thing that has a future. So I've been asked to speak about the war in Ukraine and the future of democracy. But I think that this can only be sensibly done if we start from the assumption that democracy is not a thing that has a future or doesn't have a future. Democracy is a set of human relationships which only exist insofar as humans name them and value them. And as we move into a world where we expect that the human stands in the corner and the machines are going to do the work, we're also moving into a world which is ever less democratic. So I'm taking seriously the idea of the future of democracy. It can sound a little bit cliche, like, oh, the future of democracy, surely democracy is going to be around in the future. I'm going to take this seriously in a couple of ways. One of these ways is the obvious way. Does democracy have a future? Which I think is an open question. The odds are against it, I think, at the moment. But the way that I want to take it even more seriously, or I think the more interesting question is, do we have a future without democracy? Do we, not just as a country, I mean, we belong to different countries, I assume, but do we as a species have a future without democracy? Because there's this interesting tendency, especially in the US, to say, well, you have to make these terrible choices between freedom and security, right? You got to be tough. You have to understand what life really is. Sometimes you just have to give up your freedom because there are these considerations of security. And that's mostly not true. Like, there are examples where it's true, but it's generally not true. When I was in Ukraine a month or so ago, I was struck by many of the things that President Zelensky said. But one of the things he stressed, which I think is very important, is that when you liberate a village, people can be more free and more secure at the same time. And that goes for a lot of situations. If you have healthcare, you are both more free and more secure at the same time. If global warming were removed from all of our minds, removed from reality, we would be more free and more secure. Freedom and security generally work together. So what I'm trying to suggest is that if we're going to get out of the things that most oppress us, like the future of global warming that I take it many of us are afraid of, I think it's going to be as in democracies. One reason I think that, don't worry, it's all going to come down. Those of you who are worried about when I'm talking about Ukraine, I am. It's going to sneak up on you. It's going to hit you before you know it. So the people who are in favor of global warming, and there are lots of them, the people who are in favor of global warming tend to be the oligarchs, right? The people who tend to deny, when I say in favor of, I mean deny, hem and haw, whatever, they actually love it. The people who are in favor of global warming also tend to be the people who are against democracy. Vast majorities, including in this country, when polled, believe that global warming is true and want to do something about it, right? So if we were more democratic, we would be handling global warming better than we do right now, nationally and internationally. The people who make this difficult are a category of people that I'm going to call hydrocarbon oligarchs, or perhaps more concisely, fossil oligarchs. And then now watch this, and I'm talking about Ukraine. So who is the most important hydrocarbon oligarch in the world? I'm now asking. Right. So the richest person in the world is also the most important hydrocarbon oligarch in the world, is also the person who's leading this conflict, which is the most destructive conflict we've had in decades, with the potential to do many awful things in addition to the awful things that have already happened. This regime, run by this fossil oligarch, this hydrocarbon oligarch, could not exist without the hydrocarbons. The whole structure of the regime is based upon hydrocarbons. The hydrocarbons can be weaponized abroad, as they are against Ukraine and indirectly against Europe at the moment, but also the entire vertical structure of the Russian regime, where foreign payments that come in because of the export of hydrocarbons are used to make sure that people are directly dependent upon the central government. All of that is only possible because of hydrocarbons. So the entire regime rests upon that. Where does this lead? So the thing about hydrocarbon oligarchs, they tend to be in favor of global warming, but there's a broader problem which has to do with oligarchs. So I'm talking about Ukraine, but I'm trying to talk about Ukraine in such a way that we can understand that the problems in Ukraine are very often intensifications or forecasts of problems which are true for the rest of the world, right? That Ukraine is not some isolated thing where you can say, oh, that's a faraway country, which we know little. That Ukraine is actually a kind of center, a showplace for a testing ground, if you like, for some of the things that will happen or are happening around the world. So the one of the things that happens with oligarchy is lies, big lies, right? And this is a phenomenon which has been known. Here's my conservative moment. This is a phenomenon that's been known since Plato. There are going to be others. There's a long tradition from Plato down through George Orwell. Emil Naron talks about this of explaining how oligarchy warps conversations. Right? It makes the notion of freedom of speech, as we take it for granted, kind of ridiculous. Russia is an absurdly extreme example of this. It's unusual for one person to have command of all the television networks, and the television networks to all say the same thing. That is admittedly an extreme example, right? It's unusual to have the kind of radical forms of censorship which block out independent media the way one has in Russia. Nevertheless, Russia provides a kind of ideal type, and we are moving in that direction. In general, the world is moving in that direction. We're inundated by what we think of as information, but which is only information in the digital sense. There are ever fewer human reporters who actually chase you down the facts in this country, right? So we talk about the news all the time, but we don't produce it. What the oligarchs do, aside from suppressing the voices of others or warping the conversation in general, is they fill up the discourse with crazy ideas about the future, bad ideas about the future. And I'm gonna, you can come in Q&A and say, no, I've got counter examples. But in general, the ideas that we have to spend a lot of time on, which have to do with the future, are both anti-democratic and nuts. Like for the example that you're going to live forever, right? These are American examples. That some of us are going to live forever, or you're going to go to Mars, where you're going to live forever, right? These things are not going to help us survive, and they're not going to help democracy survive. So Putin, as an oligarch, also has a crazy idea, right? He is like other oligarchs. He's actually been in touch with one of our oligarchs very recently. But like other oligarchs, he has his day things, which are generally anti-democratic and wacky. And his is that the country next to him doesn't exist, right? So we can look at all of this in regional terms. We can think of this as some kind of regional specificity that all comes down. I'm very happy to talk about this. It all comes down to disagreements about Kiev and Rus 1,000 years ago. But it doesn't really. What it comes down to is the capacity of someone who is the richest person in the world, commanding a media regime, commanding the state, to bring his absolutely indefensible ideas into some kind of reality by starting a war. The idea that Ukraine is not a real place, the Ukrainians are not a real people, the Ukraine doesn't have a history, is wacky the same way that we're going to save ourselves from global warming by going to Mars is wacky, right? It's the kind of thing that you can get yourself to believe if no one tells you the truth. It's the kind of thing you get yourself to believe if nobody is willing to challenge you. It's the kind of thing you can believe if maybe you're good at some things, but not good at everything, which is a general description of oligarchs and the way that the role that they play in our public conversation. So this war is itself very serious, and I will talk about how it's serious. But the premise upon which it is based that Ukraine is not a real people, Ukraine is not a real country, that's not serious, right? That's just idiotic. It's like, you know, there's like a saying that like you have to be a PhD to be that stupid. Okay. But there's actually a higher level of this. Which is that you have to have $20 billion to invest. Right? And Mr. Putin has attained that. So the idea that Ukraine isn't really a country, or the Ukrainians aren't really a people, it's not that that's wrong. It's not even wrong. Like it's a total misunderstanding of the way history works. What Mr. Putin is doing is that he's saying, I understand the past. He actually wrote a 7,000 word essay, which, you know, you undergraduates, whatever. I kind of now boxed myself in here. Write a better 7,000 words. Because what his idea about the past is he can see a straight line from 1,000 years ago where human agency doesn't matter, where contingency is entirely excluded, and where the things that he happens to think are absolutely true, right? And in this scheme, and now we're moving more directly to the war. In this scheme, it's very easy to say that other things don't exist. So if I'm allowed to say Russia has always been there, right? And I know what Russia always has been, and Russia has always included these territories of Ukraine. Well, if I'm allowed to say that and believe it, what follows from that is that the things that seem to be Ukraine are not real. They're not really part of history. They're artificial, they're exotic, they're corrupt. They shouldn't really be in the picture. And from that logic, it follows that I have the right to eliminate them, first rhetorically and then physically. And that's the way that Ukraine is actually talked about. The things, so from Putin's point of view, the things that he believes in are real, right? They make very little contact with reality, which means that reality has to change. That's what follows from this. So Ukraine as a society, it's defined as being not real. It's just about the Poles, or the Habsburgs, or the Germans, or the European Union, or the Jews, or the Americans, or whoever at the moment is going to be given, is going to be named as the exotic external force which created this thing, right? That's what you say. And that means I have to get rid of all the people in Ukraine who believe in this idea. But once you start doing that, then you slowly realize that actually it's quite a few people, or actually it's pretty much the entire country. So this oligarchical whimsy, right? Because I refuse to dignify it by giving it like any more credibility than it is. This oligarchical whimsy can help us understand the initiation of the war. It can also help us understand certain global features of this war. The fact that this war is being principally led by a hydrocarbon oligarch in a moment of oligarchical whimsy helps us to make sense of some of the things, which again might just seem like regional catastrophes or accidents related to this war. For example, the racial struggle for resources. Right? So Putin, like many people on the far right, is obsessed by the idea of the demographic crisis. He doesn't care about the demographic crisis. About a demographic crisis, this thing that goes by the name of replacement theory, that there are too many people who are not like us, and so on. And so the way that the war is being fought, and sometimes escapes attention, is perhaps less for territory and more for people. So the way that the Russians are fighting this war is that they are sending in the men from their own indigenous groups to be killed in Ukraine. And they're exporting back into Russia fertile women and children who they see as candidates for russification, if not in this generation, then in the future. Right? So, and they have, by their own count, they have brought into the Russian Federation more than 4 million Ukrainian citizens, which is roughly 1/10 of the population of the country. So that is a genocidal act on a self-confessed one on a very large scale. Or the world food crisis. Because Putin is a hydrocarbon oligarch carrying out this kind of war, he's giving us a sort of preview of what the wars for resources will look like in the future if we let global warming continue. So by fighting this war, by occupying the Black Sea, by blocking the trade from Ukraine, by blowing up, by executing Ukrainian agribusiness executives, by blowing up tanks filled with sunflower oil, that's happened a couple of days ago, but chiefly by making export of food very difficult. Russia is starving the world, which is bad enough, but it's also a preview of the kind of war that we can expect later on. If we start from this idea that that this war has to do with a moment of oligarchical whimsy, which has very little contact with reality. We understand its origins, its features, but also something about the course of the war and its difficulties from the Russian point of view. So this war has not been a success for Russia. This war has not gone well at all from the point of view of Russia. It also hasn't gone well at all from the point of view of the people who thought that they knew what was going to happen. That's something I'm going to return to. We're not going to stay blameless here. From the point of view of Russia, the idea is to destroy all Ukrainians, right? That's the premise. But then as you move into the war, as you move into the country, as time passes, there turn out to be far more Ukrainians than you thought. Russia's operational assumption at the beginning was that there were just a few thousand Ukrainians. It was like a thin crust of, depending upon the thinker, a thin crust of Jews, like Europeanized individuals, whatever, Americans, a thin crust, gays. It depends on the thinker, it depends on the day of the week. But people who could be characterized as being somehow from outside. And so we're just going to go, and this is literally the plan. We're going to go in, storm an airport, take Kiev, and we're going to murder them all. And then the rest of the country will just revert to being our people, right? But that didn't work, right? And it didn't work because Ukrainians resisted. And the more Ukrainians resist, the more the logic comes. We have to kill more of them, ever more. That's the way the logic works. But that logic doesn't necessarily lead to military victories. So the political ideological assumption that Ukraine doesn't exist leads to a very flawed military plan, which is one of Russia's problems, not the only one. But it also lends to a genocide which steadily escalates because the target group of people you have to get rid of has now been extended essentially to the entire population. And this is not just me saying this. This is Russian national television, which, if you're not watching it, that's why I'm here. But about a week ago on Russian national television, a Russian fascist, a man called Lubov, came on and said, so the Ukrainians are possessed. This is interesting. They're possessed. So they don't know who they are. They're really Russians. They don't know who they are. They're possessed. And so we're going to tell them they're possessed. And if they don't accept that they're possessed and are really Russians, which is, let's face it, that's a lot to ask of someone. I'm not even going to try it. But if you don't accept that you're possessed, then I'm going to kill you. And then he goes on to say, we'll kill 1 million if we have to. And they're closer to 1 million than the Ukrainians like to admit. Right? We'll kill 1 million if we have to. We'll kill 5 million if we have to. We will kill every single Ukrainian if we have to. And so this is the logic of escalation. If the more Ukrainians there are, the more one has to get rid of. Now, this raises what I think is a really interesting question of what it means to exist. What it means to exist as a political society, and perhaps what it means to exist as a political society that could become democratic. What is that thing that the Russians are running into, right? What does it mean what does it mean for a society to exist? And this is not at all straightforward. The next point that I want to make, the next big point that I want to make, is that when we define, or when we try to define whether society exists or that was a really evil bell. Maybe we'll like sharpen the pencil. So when we make the move to try to define whether society exists or doesn't exist, we're very often applying criteria that are comfortable. I know it's hard to put the phone down. I know it's really hard. When we apply criteria, we're very often doing something which has to do with the empirical character of knowledge. Okay, that might sound a little bit abstract, but it's pretty important because when we start from an imperial position, I'm going to say more about what I mean by that in a second, but we start from an imperial position and we give ourselves the right to say who exists, who doesn't exist, and under what criteria. We are then not only failing to notice some important things about existence, but we're also failing to decode what other people are doing. Okay, I've been very abstract. Let me try to be clearer about this. One example of what I'm talking about is history. So take Crimea. I mean, actually, take Crimea. The Crimean Peninsula, a lot of people would probably accept. I'm not going to like make you raise your hands or anything, but the idea that like there's Crimea has always been Russia. It's always been Russia. It's something certainly that Russians said. It's always been Russia. But it's the imperial position which allows you to define always and never. The Crimean Peninsula actually had a state which existed for about 600 years, which is not a short period of time. 200 years part of the Cold War, 400 years as the Crimean Khan, right? Much longer, incidentally, than any particular Russian state has existed. That state is taken over by the Russian Empire at the end of the 18th century and is renamed, the territory is renamed New Russia. Now, the nice thing about being able to say that something is new is that you are thereby obliterating everything, which is now defined as old, right? And so Crimea is always Russia in the sense that you get to say would never and always start. You get to say would never and always start. The moment that you inquire a little bit into the history of Crimea, you find, well, there was not only a Tatar state there for hundreds of years, you also say, well, the entire native population, and this is something very familiar from American history, of course, the entire indigenous population was deported. Every last person. I mean, it began in the late 18th century, but it was completed in 1944, when every single Crimean Tatar, every man, woman, and child, was deported by force in a matter of 3 days in spring of 1944. Every single person. Right? And so when that's done, then you can say, oh, this was always Russia, right? This was always Russia. Something similar, I mean, Crimea here. So I don't think Crimea and Ukraine are very different in this respect. When you say that Crimea was always Russia, you're in the same mode as when you say Ukraine and Russia were always together. Right? That always, if you have the power to define always, that means that you're the one who's in the imperial position. In fact, there are hundreds of years of very interesting political history in Ukraine. Most of the territory that's now Ukraine had very little to do with Moscow for most of its existence. It's a long story, we can go into it. But more interestingly, the center of Ukrainian political activity was also defined as New Russia. It's a very powerful idea, right? I get to say something as New Caledonia or New England or New Russia. But what's now southern Ukraine, where the fighting is taking place, right? Literally Kherson, which was invented and named by Empress Catherine. Those places had, before they became New Russia, were the site of Ukrainian Cossack political activity for quite a long time. But the moment that you name something as new, that history goes away. So this is a problem. I mean, I'm trying to suggest in general, these things apply everywhere. So this business of always and never is, of course, very powerful in American history. The moment that I say the founding fathers started something new, I'm exerting the same kind of magical power, right? There were still a lot of things that happened before the founding fathers, right? And there are a lot of, so when you say that the founding fathers, like these laws that we have in America, which say that you can't dismiss the reality that the founding fathers from nothing started. I'm not citing this word for word, but the basic idea is you can't dismiss the reality that the founding fathers started from nothing, created a perfect democracy, right? That's the same kind of idea, the power of defining what's always and what's never. And these memory, and that's not a joke, like the memory laws are very closely associated with conflict. In Russia, it is literally illegal, and you can now be in prison for saying the wrong things about certain parts of Russian history, right? That wave of memory laws has now come to the United States. And without going into the details of what the memory laws say, it's the same basic idea. You're always removing innocence from yourself. Okay, so what the main point I'm trying to make is that when we think about how these wars start and what it means to exist, one has to be very wary of this business of always and never, because the history is always going to turn out to be much more interesting. The second thing that in this war and in general, I think we ought to be careful about is ethnicity and language. And here's one where Americans, I think, are just hugely guilty. It's fine for us to be multicultural, right? That's cool. But if anybody else shows any sign of being multicultural, that's a big problem, and our brains immediately break, right? So it's cool for us to be, but look at Ukraine, they have 2 languages. Whoa! Right? I mean, immediately, like, we're done. We're like, okay, well, wait, if some of them speak Russian, they must be Russians. Or if they speak Ukrainian, they must be nationalists. If they speak both, then I just don't want to hear anything more about it. Right? and that is, of course, a problem, not with them, but a problem with us. It's a problem with us. It's a problem with being monolingual. But it's also a problem of thinking, we're a good enough country to be multicultural. But other people, ethnicity is good enough for them, right? And if they speak Ukrainian, they must be ethnic Ukrainians, whatever that means. If they speak Russian, they must be ethnic Russians, whatever that means. And the moment you apply this quote, this quasi-scientific term ethnic to someone, you are saying who they are. As it's over, you've categorized them as quote unquote scientific, and it's all done. But that, of course, is not the way that language or identity work, right? I mean, of course, it's much more important what you say than I'm speaking English. So I just want to like everyone from England who was like, I'm not English, right? And this is totally obvious, right? It's totally obvious. The fact that you speak Russian does not make you Russian, right? I also speak Ukrainian. That doesn't make me Ukrainian. I mean, this stuff is like mind-bogglingly obvious. And it's only this notion that like, oh, I have the power to categorize you that makes it seem even at all plausible, right? So it's much more important what people say than in what language they say it, right? That's the fundamental thing. But we're on interesting territory here because we can move towards a more positive argument. One of the things that's most interesting about Ukrainians actually, and is on display in this war, and is generally on display in Ukrainian politics, is that almost everybody is bilingual. And that bilingualism allows for forms of expression which any kind of monolingualism does not. It allows for code switching. It allows for changing, which is something I'm sure many of you are familiar with in your daily life. It allows you to change the language you're using in different settings and use different languages, deploy different languages for different purposes, right? And I have lots of cool examples of this from the war, but I'll save them. But that, remembering that people are bilingual, so if you think they're bilingual, therefore you're not sure who they are, okay, that means that you're imprisoned by this paradigm of ethnicity and language. But if you recognize that bilingualism maybe allows them to do things that you can't do if you're not bilingual, then you're closer, I think, to the truth of what it means to exist as a society. Because what the Ukrainians are doing in this war, I will that really does depend upon playing with language. The way that they're messing with the Russians depends upon them knowing Russian. And the way that they jumped into American pop culture, right, and they mobilized American pop culture in their own communications shows a general capacity to mess around with other people's languages. They're not as good at it as they are with the Russians, but they're surprisingly good at it, right? Ukrainian comms are surprisingly good, and that partly has to do with the habit of code switching and having a certain kind of distance on language. So it's not that language defines you, it's more that what you do with language defines who you want to be seen as being. So I'm now trying to move towards a more positive example of what it means to exist, right? What it means to exist as a society. And I now want to say a word about what it means for Ukraine to exist, and then maybe more broadly about what it means for a democracy to have a chance for democracy to have a future. So I'm sure there are Ukrainians here and they'll have their own views about this, but it seems to me that some of the most important characteristics of Ukrainian social existence or national existence now have to do with recent experiences which one can name. So independence in 1991, a defense of democracy in 2004, 2005, a defense of a European choice in 2014, and the war of 2022 itself. In other words, more important for existing are the things that you've done in the last 30 years, maybe, than the things that might or might not have happened in the last 1,000. In 2014, which was the time of Maidan, which were major protests in Ukraine, in 2022, the obvious thing that one sees in Ukraine, which one sees less of here and much less of in Russia, is this mysterious East civil society. So civil society is an old category. It can sound a bit abstract, but what I mean by civil society is people leaning forward into forms of cooperation which have political consequences. So the assumption that you're going to take responsibility along with other people for doing something important. This has been hugely important during the war, because it's not that the Ukrainian state is matched up against the Russian state. It's that the Ukrainian state plus Ukrainian civil society is matched up against parts of the Russian state. And by civil society, I mean, it's something, everybody I know in Ukraine who's not in the armed forces spends a lot of time driving a van. That's what you have to think of. You have to think a bunch of people who figure out like where what is needed, raise the money, collect those things, and then drive to that part of the front, or drive to the city that was just bombed. But when you're looking at the pictures of Kiev, and you're asking yourself, okay, or any city, Chernihiv, any cities that have been bombed, and you ask yourself, okay, how do the Ukrainians repair so much so quickly? Some of it's the state, but a lot of it is that people come and try to help. So Chernihiv, I was in Chernihiv last month. It's an ancient city, 7th century probably, just north of Kiev. It was bombed at the end of the war, and I was in villages and suburbs around it too. And people's houses, which have been shelled by the Russians as they're besieging the city, are all very often partly repaired. And why are they partly repaired? It's because the neighbors came and they did the things that they knew how to do, which is striking, right? Also, sometimes it's people from Kiev. That's all that's meant by civil society. It's like leaning forward to do things that you can do. So Ukraine exists, I can talk about history if people want, but Ukraine exists because of experience, because of civil society. It also exists because of democracy. Democracy in the very simple sense of choosing rulers. There was a longer tradition of this in Ukraine, but in the last 30 years, Ukrainians have successfully defended their basic right to choose their rulers, their presidents at least, by direct election, which direct election is something that we don't have in the United States, and it's unclear, by the way, that we'll be able to defend the kind of indirect election of presidents that we have that could fold in the next 8 years or less. So Ukrainians have this, like, if you talk to Ukrainians about democracy, and again, I'm happy to be corrected, but the direct election of the president, which has been defended over and over again, is also being defended now, I think is something very important. And with that is the tradition of the peaceful exchange of power, or the exchange of power. This makes Ukraine very different from Russia, where this has not happened. That you lose an election, you walk away, and the next guy comes in. When Zelensky won the election, the guy before him walked away. And this is very, not that they like each other or that everything is entirely kosher and hunky-dory between them, no. But that you have a succession of power which actually works. This has to do with national resistance. But most of all, and this is something that struck me with the president, but pretty much with everybody that I talked to the last time I was in Ukraine, I think Ukraine exists largely in a notion of freedom which has to do with the future, which I think is very important to democracy. So look, I've gotten back to the word in the title, the future. I think Ukraine largely exists because of the future. When people talk about the war, they're not just talking about something which has to end, they're talking about something which got in the way of the future. And when people talk about their notion of freedom, and this isn't just freedom from the Russians, like freedom from this terrible occupation, it's also freedom to do, like to realize the plans and projects that we had for the future. That notion of freedom, which insists that there is a future, right? That politics is fundamentally about the future. I think that's one of the ways that Ukraine actually exists. Now, it's not something you can point to. It's not, it's not quote unquote objective in the way these other things are. But I think that it's very important. And it's now moving me towards this definition, which I wanted to try to give, of what it means to exist as a nation, or what it might mean to exist as a democracy. I think it has to. I think a nation exists largely in the future, or in a common conversation about what the future might be. And this raises the question. I'm going to turn things around a little bit. This raises the question of whether Russia exists. I mean, so in our sort of baseline American, imperial framework that we fall back to when we're stressed, Russia is of course a real country. It's a great power. We have a Cold War with Russia. We take for granted that Ukraine, we're not so sure, but Russia, that must be okay. I'm not saying the Russian Federation doesn't exist as a state, but as a nation, I think that's really been called into question, at least in the sense that I'm talking about. The president of Russia never talks about the future. There is no vision of a Russian future. The dominant political thinkers in Russia don't talk about the future. They talk about a politics of us and them. They talk about the past. They talk about being a great power, but they don't talk about the future, almost to the point of taboo. And when one flips the view a little bit and asks if Russia exists as a nation, you then can ask related empirical questions. And I'd be interested in anyone can think of answers to these. But is there an example of a war fought in the name of a nation where more members of that nation have fled abroad in order not to fight it? That strikes me as really significant, right? In early 2022, when, late 2021, even early 2022, Ukrainian men were leaving their jobs around Europe, whatever those jobs might have been, and they were going to Ukraine on the assumption that they were going to have to fight. When Russians have to fight, we mobilize to leave the country. Right? On a very large, not all of them, but on a very large scale. What does that say about the imagined future of a country, right? When something like that happens? Another empirical question, and again, I don't know, so somebody can help me out, but is there another situation where so quickly in a war, a country has had to empty its prisons in order to take the convicts to the front and have them fight and die? I can't think of another example like that. That's what the Russian army, in its defensive position in Ukraine right now, the lines are made up of first prisoners, second recently mobilized people, and then what remains in the regular army is the third line. I can't think of very good precedents for that. And those are things which call into question the existence of Russia as a nation. And when I think about the Netherlands overall, I'm drawn to the conclusion, is now shifting from existence to democracy, that the arguments for the existence of Russia very much depend upon the arguments for the non-existence of Ukraine. That it's in naming Ukraine as not existing that we prove that Russia does exist. And if that's true, that would be a very significant problem, I think, for Russia, for the very basic reason that Ukraine does exist and is capable of defending its existence. But generally, you see, where I've gone with this, which is that it's if we think about the quote unquote like objective factors, like you say, oh, is there a language? Well, sure, there's a Russian language. Does it have an ancient history? Well, it claims to. Then we think, well, of course, like Russia exists. But if we shift the definition of political existence to something else, like the ability to think of a future, right, or the ability to take risks, or willingness to take risks, then the existence starts to become, I think, a lot hazier. Okay, but the point that one important thing here that I forgot to say. If my existence, political existence, depends on the denial of your existence, there's a name for that kind of politics. The name for that kind of politics is fascism. Fascism is a politics of us and them, where I define my us by defining who the them is. Carl Schmitt, the most intelligent political theorist of Nazism, makes this very clear in his writings. Politics begins with naming the enemy. And that removes the very difficult question of saying who you are, which is a difficult question, because it turns out, I believe, it's impossible to say who you are with these objective things. You can only say who you are by making some kind of commitment, taking some kind of risk, risking to advance some vision of the future, right? But you can skip all of that. You can make it much easier on yourself if you just define who the enemy is, right? So if Russia exists by virtue of negating the existence of its neighbor, that is the politics of us and them, which is a fascist politics. Okay, but I don't mean for this to be all about Russia and Ukraine, as I keep saying. I actually mean for this to be deeply about us. I want to end by inquiring about where we got things wrong, or what our own sense of the objective factors was, such that we could lose track of democracy in this country, as I believe we have done, but also so that we could misanalyze Ukraine and Russia. And what I want to say here is the last argument. What I want to say here is that the moment 1991, when Russia and Ukraine became independent countries, when Russia, by the way, brought about the end of the Soviet Union, there are lots of funny rumors about who brought about the end of the Soviet Union. I was there at the time. It was American policy to keep the Soviet Union going. it was Boris Yeltsin who brought about the end of the Soviet Union. Russia took itself out of the Soviet Union, and that's how the thing came to an end. But that's just a parenthesis. That's 1991, the moment when Ukraine becomes an independent country, Russia becomes an independent country, is also the beginning of our story that's like American. An American story about objective factors. An American story about how objective factors, outside structures, abstract concepts brought about democracy. What are those concepts? What are those abstractions? What are those structural factors? The structural factors, this is going to sound really familiar, is the idea that there are no alternatives. There are no alternatives. The world is just such that there are no alternatives to democracy, and it's therefore it's the absence of other things which is going to lead to democracy. Now, imagine you're in a relationship and you say to the person you care about, well, you know what? Like, I'm as good as it gets. There are no alternatives. Like, that relationship is not going to last very long. Because the person you're talking to is going to find someone who has much better pickup lines than that. So it's a little bit like with democracy. If you say there are no alternatives, first of all, it's obviously wrong. There are plenty of alternatives. But it's worse than that. When you say that there are no alternatives to democracy, you are directly contradicting what democracy means. When you say there are no alternatives to structural factors that bring about, what you're saying is that the people don't matter. And if the people don't matter, then it's not democracy. It can't be democracy. Something which is brought to you cannot be democracy. Right? It can't be. I mean, because as you all very well understand, probably the young people now, the structural factors don't work in your favor. That's not how it goes at all. Democracy and freedom have to be worked against the structural factors, with knowledge of what the structural factors are. Democracy and freedom have to be human undertakings, based upon some kind of ethical commitment. The moment that you say it's the structural factors, you're losing the habit of struggle. You're losing the consciousness that any of this is a struggle, and you're abandoning ethics. Because if you're saying the objective world as it is objectively brings democracy, then you're abandoning the entire moral part of the world. You're abandoning ethics entirely. It's all gone. So the structural factors, it's empirically wrong, right? So what were the structural factors? The structural factors, aside from alternatives, this other structural factor was capitalism. Capitalism is associated with democracy. But I'll make this very quick. Russia's capitalist, China's capitalist. There are a lot of countries that are capitalist. It's been a great century for capitalism. It's been a bad century for democracy. Happy to talk about the details, but that's the way it basically looks. The idea that capitalism is going to bring democracy, just like any structural factor is going to bring democracy, means that it's not the people, right? And if the structural factors then become the things which are sacred, right? Now, and finally, if you think that the structural factors have to bring about democracy, that there aren't any alternatives, you lose the ability to think about alternative futures, good ones, bad ones, whatever. If there's only one possible future, capitalism brings democracy, then why are you going to be thinking about all the other possible futures if there's only one? And if you lose that capacity to think about multiple futures, then you lose the capacity for a democratic person. Because a democratic person is someone who can envision multiple possible futures and try to make some of them real in the world. Okay, so I want to now just bring this up to the moment when this war starts. In February of this year, I'm going to make this personal because I can work best that way. In February of this year, I did an interview for 60 Minutes, which for those of you under the age of 75 is a television program which seems to still air. I actually wasn't so I lost track of myself. Now I'm never another. So I did an interview on 60 Minutes the week before the war was going to start. And they asked me a bunch of questions, but the thing they kept returning to, because I wanted to hear me say it over and over again, was, is Zelensky going to flee? And I said, no, he's not going to flee. And my analysis for what it was worth was, I said, he's a little guy, he's used to staying up with big guys, he's not going to flee, he's going to stick. Then much laughter ensued. Like, they made me record it multiple times, like to get their laughter out of the shot. Like, much laughter ensued. Much mockery on social media then ensued. There was a class at Yale where one of my colleagues brought in Obama security advisors, Trump security advisors on the screens, and he replayed this clip from 60 Minutes. And they were like professional enough not to laugh at me, but they said, Professor Snyder, with all due respect to your historical achievements and so on, he's going to run. He's going to run. They all said he's going to run. No exceptions. No exceptions. Why was everyone so sure of that? I think I know why. I mean, not to be too ad persona, but it's because they would have all run. But to make a more structural point, it's this. If you think democracy is about the structural factors, and the structural factors turn against you, what are you going to do? Run. Because there's nothing in the world except those structural factors. And writ large, that is what has happened to us. The structural factors have turned against us, or maybe they were never really on our side in the first place. And so then what do? Right? Then what do? You adapt, you normalize, you just go along. And when an acute crisis appears, as with Russia invading Ukraine, it simply doesn't occur to people. I mean, I'm sure it occurs to some of you, but it doesn't occur to people in general that you might actually do something. Right? It doesn't occur to you that you might actually just stick, because if you think it's all about structural factors locally, well, here's this Russian-speaking guy, this country that Russia says is Russia. Why would he say anything else? Well, because locally it's not about the structural factors. And looking at it globally, well, it's a smaller country facing a bigger country with what's supposed to be a much better army. How can he possibly stay? All the larger factors say he should go, but he didn't. Right? He didn't. And the fact that he didn't go, right? The fact that Ukrainians chose to fight, reminds us of something essential about both social existence and democracy, which is that it depends upon working against the larger conditions. It depends upon injecting technical commitments, taking corporeal risk. One little point about this. So a few days after that, well, obviously, as you all know, Zelensky stayed, the Ukrainians fought, and they're now defeating Russia. Which pretty much no one thought was possible. Comparing America and Russia a little bit, and I'll just make this final point. The analysis in Washington is exactly the same as the analysis in Moscow. Everyone thought the Ukrainians would be done in 3 days. I was publishing articles in February about Ukraine, and my friends who were connected said, Tim, stop publishing this stuff because in 3 days you're going to look like an idiot. Right? That was what people thought was the wisdom in both Washington and Moscow. 3 days. And my view is that fundamentally we were neglecting the same thing. Right? We were neglecting the sense in which Ukraine actually exists, or the sense in which Ukraine is actually democracy. But the thing I wanted to add is about free speech. So on campuses, there's a lot of talk about free speech. There's a lot of talk about free speech on campuses. I'm going to give you an example of what I think free speech actually is. When a couple of days into the war, Zelensky comes out of the administrative building. It's the evening. There are bombs are still falling on Kyiv. There are assassins in Kyiv who are tasked to kill him personally. He comes out of the building. He takes out his phone and he says, "The president is here." Right, and then he goes to his crew and they're all there. Right, and why is that so important? Why is that? Well, first of all, he's telling the truth. That's important. But secondly, he's denying Russian propaganda because the Russians invaded. Of course, the thing he said is, Zelensky fled, the government fled, it's all over. So he's denying Russian propaganda. But there's something more fundamental here, I think, which is essential to freedom of speech, which is that it isn't just that you speak the truth, it's that you speak the truth to power, taking a risk. That's what freedom of speech is actually for. The long argument for freedom of speech, which begins with Euripides, says that freedom of speech is there in order to speak truth to power, taking bodily risk. So yes, you can come to campus and you can say obnoxious things, and then people criticize you and say it's my freedom of speech. But that doesn't make you a defender of freedom of speech. It just makes you a coward. You can take advantage of freedom of speech, just say all kinds of crazy things to make people upset. Fine. That doesn't make you a champion of freedom of speech. It makes you a consumer of freedom of speech. Right? What Zelensky did was demonstrate what freedom of speech actually means. And it's a minor example of the larger point of what I'm trying to say, which is that if there's going to be democracy in the future, that democracy is going to have to be defended, not just in the practical sense that Ukraine is defending it, but also in a kind of sense of moral commitment, right? Where we say we want a democracy, right? I mean, the reason that I'm fascinated by this is that, no, seriously, is that it's like, I don't want to be over here. I don't want to be over here. I want to be here talking to you. Like, democracy really is falling apart in the United States. It really is falling apart in the rest of the world. And we could spectate, right? We could spectate. We could say the larger forces are with us, now they're against us. What can we do, right? Or we can actually say, we want to rule, right? We want to rule. It's better than other systems. We want to rule. So Ukraine is defending democracy in the obvious senses. It is an imperfect democracy. It's defending itself against the tyranny. It's resisting the precedent that Russia is setting about a tyranny attacking by force of democracy, which is no small thing. That hasn't happened very often recently. What happens in this war will set morale for authoritarians everywhere, right, in this country and around the world. It has major effects, for example, in China, what happens in this war. But fundamentally, and you got the point, is that if the Ukrainians lose, then what is being lost is this idea that you take risks, right? That democracy is a kind of ethical commitment. And we will have missed our chance to notice this kind of thing, that the people have to want to rule. And that you know, when rulers say that they represent, which is a word that Steve was obsessed with, kept returning to, represent. That when leaders represent, it's not just they're representing interests, they're representing also what they think their people is, like what the people are, how they exist, what they actually mean. So I think this war does have to be won, not just for the future of democracy. I think this war has to be won so that there can be a future. Right? I think this war has to be won so that we will be able to see some kind of a future. And that's in a way, like, that's what this is all about. The question I try to say, you know, does democracy have a future, isn't just some kind of rhetorical throwaway. The notion of democracy and the future are very, very closely connected. We have to recognize the possibility that Ukraine will lose this war. We have to recognize the possibility that democracy will fail in this country, which I think is a very proximate possibility. We have to recognize those possibilities. We also have to be able to see better possibilities. Ukraine can and should win this war. They will win it unless we let them down at this point, right? That is possible. It didn't seem possible to most people who matter just a few months ago. But now it's not only possible, it's probable. But it's only probable because people did things which it seemed like the structural factors would have prevented them from doing. That's the basic lesson. So democracy and the future are very closely connected to one another. We have to not only just see that democracy is at risk and that there could be undesirable futures, we also have to be able to imagine the desirable ones. And I think Ukraine has done something to help us with all of that. So I have taken a lot of time now. I have to catch a ferry towards often long. But in the time between now and then, I want to be able to answer your questions because you're asking things I can't predict. I'm looking forward to what this is going to be. Thanks very much. You want to go first?
Yes. I studied at Moscow State University and I speak Russian, but Mr. Putin shouldn't think that I'm Russian. What I want to say is during my stay, 6 years in Moscow, I traveled extensively to all the former Soviet republics, including Ukraine and Crimea. And what I did notice is everybody speaks Russian. So if Putin thinks that Ukraine doesn't exist, yes, I'm going. If Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine and the people exist, what is the future of the former Soviet republics where they also speak
I think there is. I think the question is absolutely justified. A few days ago, the president of Tajikistan raised a furor by suggesting that Tajikistan was a country that Russia should respect, which of course was a notion that we found what would be greeted by wide surprise in Russian media. And by the way, that is also a result of this war. The fact that Ukraine has resisted Russia has made it easier for other people to assert their own sovereignty in various ways. I think though there is a difference between the way the specific obsession that Mr. Putin has with Ukraine. I believe that I have this idea that like people who are cynical about everything are naive about one thing, and I think he really is naive about Ukraine. I think he has a kind of, I think his views about Ukraine are childish. I think he really does believe that there's something special about this baptism made by the Scandinavian warlord. I think he really does believe that. I don't think he has that kind of mystical view about the former Soviet Union. So I think he thinks the former Soviet Union are kind of like imperial objects, of course. But he doesn't have the same view. He says like the Russians are the same people and stuff. That's the specificity he has towards Ukraine. I want to make sure we hear from the students.
Yeah, why don't you proceed with your hand?
So, yeah, sure.
Hi, I just wanted to, I'm wondering what you think should be the relationship, this is straying a little from Ukraine and Russian, but what the relationship between them, a democratic government and religion should be, because of course in the US we have a lot of like government and religion should be separate, but earlier this year there was a ban, well not a ban on abortion, but a ban on the law that said like abortion should be for everyone, and whatever view you have on that, it's definite that a lot of views come from religion, and the Supreme Court probably a couple of people had that. And so what I'm trying to say, the point is we are now kind of going into a line between where religion and democracy are starting to intertwine with each other, and what do you think should be the relationship and what could come from that?
I'm going to get to that, but it reminded me of something which is really interesting about Russia and Ukraine. So just this whole idea that Ukrainians are possessed, it rolls back to a form of Christian fascism. So not like everybody has fascism. This happens to be Christian fascism, which is at the end of the anti-Semitic. The view is something like Russia is the only power that's capable of restoring the innocence of the world, and therefore anything Russians do anything Russians do in the war or destruction doesn't matter. It's justified because it's an act of restoration of the world, and people don't understand the special Russian mission. They're possessed. And so, like the liberal West, like the things that we think of, like pluralism, ideas, facts, and all that, that's just actually possession. And Ukrainians thinking they're Ukrainian, it's possession. And I raise this because this is actually going on. It's actually not a significant factor in the Russian political conversation. But the cues are not always picked up. So when this guy Gubarov talks about murdering millions of Ukrainians because they're possessed, that's not as far as from the mainstream as one might wish that it were. There was a lot more discussion in Russia about Satanism and how people are possessed by devils, and therefore then one would really like to hear. And it's funny because it's religion, but it's like it's religion. It's a kind of self-worship because it's by a bunch of people who never go to church, and their version of Christianity is hard to recognize. Which leads me to your question. I believe in the separation of church and state is a very good idea, and I think we're certainly running a great risk in this country where we pack the Supreme Court with people who have obviously religious views which they are unable to defend in any kind of persuasive jurisprudence, which is where we are. We have a kind of special interest domination of the Supreme Court, which makes the law on the kinds of things that you're talking about. So that's where I see the problem. The places, the Constitution is supposed to separate church and state, but if you make the guardians of the Constitution in the majority of people who represent, it's a long story about how big money came to capture much of the Supreme Court, which I can't tell here, but if you make the Supreme Court basically captured by special interests, which hold quite, I think, very difficult to defend views on this issue, then you end up where we are now.
My name is Ekaterina. I'm coming from Moldova. My question would be the next. Speaking about the future of Russia, Putin did say that he wants a new world order. Seizing Ukraine basically isn't the only goal of his. We will definitely see world change. How do you think the world will change, and will it fit into Putin's
Certainly, right, absolutely. They talk about geopolitical futures, but I would defend my view by saying that the geopolitical part is a device to avoid talking about the future for Russians. So Russia needs to be a great power forever is sort of the future, but that version of the future means we're not going to talk to you about poverty in the countryside or massive corruption or any of the other things. We're not talking about oligarchy, the difficulties of starting a small business. These things we're not going to talk about because we're talking about how we're a great power. So that's how it's all connected. I'm actually hopeful. I mean, as I said, I think the Ukrainians are going to win it, and I think I think it's good. I mean, it's horrible if there's a war, but once there's a war on imperial war, that's always a chance for the imperial side to lose. And if the imperial side should lose, this is not a situation where you can say war is terrible, and so therefore doesn't matter who wins. Yeah, war is terrible, but the side who started it should lose. And they should lose in a way which discourages them and people like them from fighting similar wars in the future. So I can't say which way it's going to go, but what I do think is that a lot hangs on who wins. If the Russians win, if the Russians had already won, we'd be in a much darker place than we are right now. Like this kind of talk that I just gave would be seen completely otherworldly. But it would seem insane, basically. The fact that Ukrainians fought and resisted means that we can have these conversations about what is democracy. So if the Russians had won, we would all be like, oh, authoritarians are better, more efficient, technocrats, and so on. We just have to deal. So a lot hangs on humans. But if the Ukrainians win, a couple of other things happen, which might happen. I think we could be looking at a world where we'll look back at this and say, okay, that was the last blush of territorial autonomy. Because in the long, I didn't talk much about history here. I talked about the future and ethics and so on. But in the long span of European history, we're at the end of 500 years of empire, I think. And historically speaking, it's like one last try at an imperial war. And I think it would be good for the Russians, just as it was good for the French and the Germans, and the Portuguese and the Spanish and so on, to lose their imperial war. And that gives them a chance to try some other form of regime. Want me to choose? Okay, I have two. So please, yes, the teach second.
I'm told about democracy being like rather than structure, but about people, but are insane. So how, speaking on this like philosophical grand scale, how do you think of making sure that the structure is there to enable democracy rather than to disable it?
That's a brilliant question. I agree 100%. Because it's not that structures don't matter. They do matter. It's just not that the ones that happened to exist in 1991 at a given point were on our side, right? So it's democracy. If democracy doesn't happen by itself, which it doesn't, then if freedom doesn't happen by itself, it doesn't. That means that you have to have this kind of ethical conversation, which precedes the conversation about what kind of structures you want to have. So, and then here, it wouldn't just be about the obvious things, like we should have a truly representative democracy, there shouldn't be money, there shouldn't be money involved. Like that stuff is kind of obvious, but the deeper question is, how then do you, so you say it's saying, like, how do you raise people who care about their own freedom and are capable of making value choices and thinking about ethics in this way, right? So this is going to sound like a big jump, but one of my preoccupations is early childhood development. Early childhood development is absolutely essential for democracy. The things that we know about early childhood development, if we apply them, it would make it much easier for people to be, what you say, less insane, more likely to be the kinds of people who can take part in conversations about multiple futures. So I can give you a bunch of other examples, but like I take the premise as absolutely correct. It's not just that any old structure is bad. It's that if you want democracy, you have to think about what are the structures which actually make it more likely. This is what my problem with the American conversation about freedom in general. Like we think that freedom is just like get off my back. That's not freedom. Like freedom means being the kind of person who can evaluate various different kinds of choices and apply different kinds of ethics to them, and make it, and having made choices change the future and so on, right? That's not so easy, but it requires then thinking about, okay, what kind of child rearing do you do for that? What kind of schools do you do for that? You clean water for that. You have to get rid of poverty for that, right? There are a lot of things you have to do to get to that point where you can really talk about reading seriously. So I appreciate the question. I'm going to go, you please.
As well. I think we make this the last question and then wrap things up.
Okay.
Go ahead, Chad.
Early made a report by the that there was a peace deal that meant that Russia would go back to its pre-February borders, Ukraine would join NATO and do some kind of Donbass, Crimea, how do you feel about this deal? How do you feel about the U.S. involvement in the deal of the deal because they reported that Russian consequences dealt with in that America? It would not wrap up.
Talking about particulars about how.
Oh, foreign affairs also.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah. No, I follow, but I'm. Yeah. So I'll tell you my basic view is that Ukrainians are fighting this war, and the Americans are in a nice position to be a supply line, and the Ukrainians are now doing all kinds of things that are really important for the Americans. But what we're doing for them is actually quite small, and it's pretty important to keep that in mind. Like the weapons that we're giving them doesn't make any difference to us. It doesn't take anything, right? And what they're doing with the weapons is they're changing not only the balance of power in Europe, but they're also making it much less likely that China's going to play for Taiwan. So Ukrainians are doing a lot for the Americans, and as Americans, our first move is to always say that we're doing a lot for you. Like that's like breathing for us. In this case, the Ukrainians are doing a lot for us. I kind of fear that we don't really recognize even how much they're doing for us. Like the amount, like for what we're giving them from our defense budget is honestly, it's like a rounding error. Our defense budget is almost $1 trillion. It's $800 billion a year. We're giving Ukrainians, like if our defense budget were bigger or smaller by that amount, we wouldn't even really notice, honestly. So my basic idea here is that the Ukrainians are the ones who were attacked. The Ukrainians are the ones who are fighting this war, and the Ukrainians are the ones who negotiate. And they'll negotiate what they negotiate when they negotiate it. I don't believe that there's any way to end this war. So I would like this war to end. I would like this war to end, but I don't think it can end any other way than the Ukrainians winning it. I think that if you try to go for some kind of middle ground, then you're just going to be replaying the whole scenario again before very long, maybe not just on the scale of Ukraine. So I'm not going to comment on particular things. My basic sense is that the Ukrainians want to win, and we should be doing it. And that would be the best outcome for everybody. As I said, in response to your question, also for Russia, it would be really good for Russia. I mean, we had this weird tendency to say, well, what about Putin's feelings? Maybe Putin's going to fall from power, and I think that's such a strange thing to hear about. Like all the things in the world, like a guy who has $60 billion, he's been running the country for 20 years. Like I bet undergraduates have real problems. That he's going to fall from power. I don't care. And but more importantly, they always fall from power. So I think the way that I see this is that we should let the Ukrainians win, or help them to win as quickly as possible. And then there will be negotiations, which will be of a much simpler character. I think for the Russians, it would be best if all the Russian troops got out of Ukraine. I think that would be a fresh start for them. I think it would be a very good thing for them. I think Ukraine allows Russia to be imperialist, and without occupying Ukraine, Russia would not be imperialist. I think that would give Russia a fresh start. So I realize I'm not commenting on a particular deal. I'm just revealing my own, what I think about this, in general, which is that I think the way for this war to end is for us to recognize just how much agency the Ukrainians have in it, just how much they have suffered, just how reasonable it is for them to think they should try to win. If they reach the conclusion that they can't win, in the sense that you might have noticed about a lot of my talk was about latent imperialism, and a lot of it is also been about listening to Ukrainians themselves on these things. And my view is that if they decide they can't go any further, then okay, then let them negotiate with the Russians. But that is really not where they are right now. It's not just that Zelensky has 9% approval rating is also that roughly 90% of Ukrainians think they're going to win back every bit of Ukrainian territory, not just win the war, but all of it, right? Like maybe they'll be wrong, but I've noticed that so far in this war, they've tended to be right. We tended to be wrong. So let's wait and see. But I don't think we should be pushing the Ukrainians to do the thing, to do the things which they don't want to do while they're fighting for all their territory. I think they reached the conclusion that it's gone on long enough. And it's actually has to do with democracy in a funny way. Like, so let's see the Democratic elected president. It's quite clear that he thinks that he's representing his people and fighting the way he's fighting it. If he sees his people taking a different view, I think he'll also take a different view. But I think like the war itself has to play out and then see what view the Ukrainian people actually take. So I'm closing on kind of the thing that I led with, which is the democratic theme. It's I think the record of the war shows thus far that the people who from far away tried to pick the conditions on which Ukrainians going to survive have not done very well. And then the people who are actually fighting the war, much to our surprise, have generally done pretty well at predicting what was going to happen next. Like back, I talk about this things, but back in the early summer, I was saying there's going to be offensive in Kherson, and offensive in Kharkiv, and they're going to win. And that's what I think still. But that was not like like back in April, we thought that was going to be true. Right? So I think I'll just close with one more thought for out of time. There's a weird way in which people on the left don't believe in winning anymore. And I think that's kind of unfortunate. Because there are times when you really have to win. And I'm speaking of course about America too, right? There are times when you have to win. Like there are times when it's not enough to be on the right side. And I can say this for like first person knowledge, the American approach to this war was not that the Ukrainians had a chance to win. The American approach at the beginning was, we want to be on the right side. And then it moved to, well, maybe we can help them in negotiations. And it's only very recently that it's dawned on people in positions of responsibility in the United States that Ukraine might actually win the war. Only very recently. But this category of winning, I think it's unfortunate that Trump is going to take it away. Like it's unfortunate that we don't people don't think that we can win. Sometimes you actually have to win. So I'm gonna leave you with